I am fascinated by these markets. I enjoy being with people who come with new inventions. I enjoy seeing the energy when you take an idea and say, I want to make this into a business. Very few people can do that really well, but the ones who can give so much energy to everybody who are around them, so I love that. I also like very much that innovation and venture capital contribute to making society rich and to solve a lot of problems and give us a lot of experiences that we wouldn't have otherwise. If you think about humanity, mankind, and take the very long perspective, how old is Homo sapiens? Scientists tend to say around 200,000 years old. So most of that time we lived in caves, and the average lifespan was something like 18 years old, and it was not easy. But there was a little bit of innovation along the way, and in about 8,000 years ago we started to get the first civilizations, and then people started writing with clay and stuff. But it was even much later that we really saw a very aggressive acceleration in our innovation. Some of it came in classical Greece, some of it even before in China. But in the period between 1450 and 1550, something completely incredible happened in a small part of Western Europe. So you saw that acceleration. You saw an acceleration in innovation that has never been seen before in the history of mankind. And with that came not only new inventions, but also new ideas that make it easier to make inventions. So, for instance, the patent law was invented, the postal system, and so on. So all of this contributed to this acceleration, and this has been going on forever since. There's something interesting that happened at that period, and you had these families, for instance, in Venice, who would go together, and each of them they would contribute some money towards building a merchant ship. And then they would hire a captain. The captain would find his crew. He would sail out and hopefully trade and make some money. And this could be extremely profitable. Sometimes a ship would sail out, and just in its first trip, it would pay for itself. And then everything else would be big profits. But it was also very, very dangerous. Many of the ships never returned, so all was lost. They were attacked by pirates, they ran into reefs or whatever. So the captains were given 20% of the profits for doing this. And so in English you would say they was given 20% of the carry, of what they were carrying. And the funny thing is that if you look at both the private equity and venture capital today, you talk about that the management who run the funds, they are called the general partners, but they get 20% carry, so they get 20% of the profit. And the concept of somebody sailing out to the Far East or to Africa or later to the Americas on a dangerous and difficult journey, but in the hope of creating great business, is just so fascinating. The mentality that some people, they jointly pool some money and they take the risk, and they might lose all the money in every single venture that happens, but then again they might make a lot of money. It's interesting. Now the term venture capital is pretty new, and the idea that it's not only some rich families that go together, but that also pension funds and other institutional investors can join in the party is quite new. The first people who made what we would call a real venture capital fund was the former assistant dean at Harvard University, who went together with the leader of MIT and together with one more, and they created American Research and Development Association in 1947, so just after World War II. What was unique about this was that unlike, for instance, these Venetian families who would invest in boats, in this company it was not only families, it was also institutional investors, could be pension funds, for instance, that could invest in this company. So they made different investments, and of course they looked for a home run. They looked for something that would go really, really well. And in 1957, they found one. They didn't know at the time, but they invested in Digital Equipment Corporation. They invested $70,000, not a small amount in 1957, but not a huge amount either. But they invested this $70,000. 11 years after, they were able to make an exit on that investment for $355 million. So they made their money back 1,200 times. So do you think that had a reaction in the area? Of course it had. Everybody thought, wow, one thing is to invest in bonds and listed stocks, but this 1,200 times the money back. So some of the employees from this company, they went out and started new venture funds, and you had others like Sequoia and so on starting up. And many of them, they started in Sand Hill Road in Silicon Valley, as it's called now, which goes through Palo Alto and Menlo Park and further on to Woodlands. So that became like the ground zero for the venture capital industry. Venture capital in general has been a high performance investment class, and of course the venture capitalists have worked a lot on developing the techniques, finding out what works and doesn't work. So they got more and more skilled over time. Of course, they also got more competition over time. But still, if you look at the Yale endowment, which for many, many years has been, for me, the intellectual Himalaya in asset allocation. If you look at how they allocate the money, the target allocation for 2019, for instance, is 18% for venture capital. 18%. That is a massive overweight. Why do they make this massive overweight? Because they know from the past that this asset class has been very, very important contributor to the overall returns. So it is a fascinating business to be in. There's a lot of money to be made. There's also a lot of money to be lost, I have to say. But there's something else about it that I really like, and this is that you benefit society so much by creating and funding and helping innovation. William Nordhaus, a scientist, he did a famous study of how big a part of the returns from these activities actually go to the founders, so the innovators themselves, and how much benefits society. You wouldn't believe the number if you haven't heard it. It turns out that it's mainly society as a whole that benefit from these entrepreneurs. According to his studies, it's only 4% of the gain from entrepreneurship that accrues to the founders of the companies. The rest is to society at large, and that comes in form of course, jobs, taxes that are paid, but a lot of it comes because products become cheaper and products become more efficient. The most obvious example that we all can think of is computing. A smartphone today is like a supercomputer, much better than the biggest computer in the world just a few years ago. So now so many people can afford to buy this, and before they couldn't. Another example is farming. If you go back a few hundred years, more than 95% of the people who lived in the US were doing farming. That was what they did. Now it's 2%. So the 2% are able to feed the American population and more with no difficulty at all. So how does that work? That's because of innovation. Did that make the farmers super wealthy, or the people who sold equipment to them super wealthy? In some cases, yes, but generally the main effect was that food became more affordable for everybody. So whereas in the old days you would spend maybe half your budget or something like that on food, now for most people food is not a big part of their spending, it's quite a small part of their spending. Same with computers. Today we run around with these smartphones and stuff, and every smartphone has more computing power than the biggest mainframe in the world just a couple of decades ago or less. So you benefit society by investing in entrepreneurship, and you the better you do it, the better you are at picking the winners, which means that the better you are at making money for yourself, the more you benefit society. And this is a thing that I like very much.
Do you speak future?